debt with immigrant populations is the #1 way that these folks are held in submission. It's not chains, it's not physical bondage, it's simply they feel as though they have a debt that they have to pay off. They're often coming from societies that being honest is incredibly important, and they genuinely believe that if they can just pay off this debt, they'll be fine. Pimps, again, who are preying on these young girls, very common. Drugs, both in labor trafficking and sex trafficking. It's very common for pimps or traffickers to get their get their victims addicted to some form of substance. Alcohol, drugs, you name it. And the real reason for doing that is that they then have to go back to their trafficker because they're physically addicted. And so it's a great control mechanism for the trafficker to be able to kind of loud over that survivor is you have to keep coming back. Pimping with sex trafficking generally is happening online at this point. Craigslist, in theory, did away with their adult services section. In practice, there's still prostitution that's taking place on there. But different pages, use of pages like Sugar Daddy and Backpage and these various other online forums. And then, like I said, social media, MySpace, Facebook, pimps are on there recruiting as well. And there is this concept of the guerrilla pimp that takes place, where once they've gotten the usually young woman into a trafficking situation, they are incredibly brutal. And the worst story that I've heard in this regard is a pimp who, there was a young woman who was being forced to prostitute for him, and she was, of course, having to turn over all of her money. She had a quota of something like $2,000 a night that she had to make, and she was going to come up a couple of bucks short anyway, and she knew that she was going to get beaten, and she was starving because the pimp was not feeding her. So she took a couple more bucks out of what she made to buy herself something to eat at a fast food restaurant. She goes back, the pimp says, "You're short." She says, "I know." He brings in all of the other young women who he's forcing to prostitute, lines them up against the wall, and brutally beats this girl to within literally an inch of her life. By the time she got into the emergency room, she had a broken nose. There was something with her eye socket where her eye socket was set back. Just really, really horrible abuse that had taken place as a result of what this pimp had done. And when he was interviewed, he said, "Look, I made my point to the other girls who work for me that they're not going to get away with that. They have to make their quota."
Chris, who brought that girl into the ER?
That was law enforcement, believe it or not, and this was a pretty skeezy hotel that this was taking place at. And believe it or not, the proprietor or whoever was working at the motel actually could hear the beating taking place. And I mean, he'd seen some bad stuff happening and never really cared, but he knew that this was beyond what he'd experienced before, and he actually called law enforcement. So I believe it was Portland police who ended up taking the person in. And then the report was sent to Multnomah County, and that's how I heard about the report, was because it went through Multnomah County, and I worked very closely with them. But yeah, it's often local law enforcement that's going to be presenting in an ER setting or in a medical setting. People are bought and sold not in the way that we think of anymore. This whole idea of street prostitution does still take place, but not nearly as often with trafficking specifically. When you're looking at children and when you're looking at immigrants, you're looking often at brothel models. And brothels, again, not what we think of. We're not talking about red light districts in Amsterdam and that sort of thing. The brothels that we see are usually in suburban neighborhoods. They're exactly where law enforcement would not normally look. And so what we see is these brothels in, like I said, suburban neighborhoods get raided. They're essentially a shell of a house, maybe a room, a couple mattresses on the floor, a couple of sheets thrown up to divide each space, lots of alcohol, lots of condoms, all sorts of sex-related paraphernalia lying around. Those are the brothels where these kids are being prostituted. those are the brothels where immigrant victims are being prostituted. Use of online forums, very, very common these days. And then within labor trafficking, we're seeing a lot of swapping of victims, where a victim maybe is within somebody's house or restaurant or field or whatever for a number of years, and then so that that victim doesn't get too smart as to where they are and be able to escape the situation, they're traded with somebody else in another area. Statistics. I put these up here with a grain of salt. Statistics are notoriously hard to get with the issue of human trafficking. And I mean, they are pretty much impossible to get. The best statistics that we have are the statistics that federal grantees provide to the government on the population that they serve. Unfortunately, the population that we serve is most often a population that has already escaped their trafficking situation. So we're not even seeing a fraction of the actual trafficking cases that exist, but we report the cases that we see. So that being said, these are some federal estimates as to what's happening with trafficking in the United States. And this is what the Department of Justice believes is happening, this is what HHS believes is happening, but there's no way to back these statistics up with hard evidence. It's a hidden crime, and until it's not a hidden crime, it's going to be incredibly hard to determine how much of an issue it actually is. And the question we get asked all the time, why do victims stay? Trafficking, very similar to where domestic violence was 30 years ago. First of all, people didn't want to talk about it even though they knew it existed. Second of all, there was a lot of victim blaming that took place, and a lot of saying, well, why don't people just run away? Unfortunately, that's often still the case with domestic and sexual violence. But in trafficking, you hear about this all the time, is why don't these folks leave their situation? Well, they're totally unfamiliar with where they are, for one. They don't speak the language, they don't understand the culture, they've just been dropped into the situation, and they have no trust for anybody who is supposed to be there to help them. So fear of deportation is huge, because their trafficker has really drilled that into them. Fear of abuse by law enforcement. In many of these folks' home country, law enforcement is the abuser. So the idea of going to law enforcement is not something that survivors think of. Fear of the government, and for that matter, fear of healthcare providers. Unfortunately, in a lot of the home countries of these survivors, when you're going into a hospital, that's not a place that you go to get help. That's a place where you go to die and be quarantined from the rest of society. Victims are kept totally isolated, their movement is restricted, they physically can't leave. There's often barbed wire around the compounds in which they're held. There are dogs, there are armed employers who will forcibly keep victims in their situation. The victim is confined to small spaces to eat, to sleep. They have to ask permission to do anything, including permission to use the bathroom, which is often denied to them. Fear for their family members is huge as well. Probably, aside from death, that's the number one thing that we've heard from the immigrant survivors that we serve, is that their families are threatened. You can be in the worst situation in the world. You can be being forced to work 20 hours a day, be pulled aside and sexually assaulted at any point during that day, be forced into prostitution when you're not working out in the field or working in a restaurant, be physically beaten on a regular basis, and if a trafficker who brought you here from a country in Central America, for example, says, I know how I got you here, I still have contacts in the home country, and if you think this is bad, just imagine what we could do to your family, to your daughter, to your mother, to your sister, to your husband, to whoever. That's enough to keep these folks in their situation pretty much forever. And that's what we hear from most of the survivors that we work with, is that, well, there was threats to my family and I couldn't leave. Victims might be completely dependent on their trafficker for everything. So if they were to leave, they literally would leave with clothes on their back. And a number of survivors that we work with, that's the situation. When they come into contact with us, That's what they have. They have the clothes on their back, no money, no documentation, no physical possessions of any kind, and often they don't even know where they are. They're constantly watched and escorted by their trafficker. They're guarded by their trafficker or associates of the trafficker at every single turn. And I'll get into why that's important in the medical profession, particularly shortly. Traffickers will coach their victims to answer a cover story. They'll always have the same story over and over again, and you quickly kind of realize that it's a canned story. Victims develop loyalties and positive feelings towards their trafficker. This is known as trauma bonding. I have really stayed pretty far away from psychological trauma in this presentation because it's so far out of my area of expertise. But there are some really amazing local advocates, local practitioners who I would be happy to provide you, information, their contact information regarding the issue of trauma bonding. It's essentially a coping mechanism, and it can literally change how your brain is essentially wired to defend a trafficker at every single turn. And that is a major problem for the U.S. citizen children. It's not as big of a problem with the immigrant population, generally because when they leave, they want to leave. And when these guys escape, they usually escape on their own kind of free will. Whereas with U.S. citizen children who are trafficked, when they escape, it's usually because law enforcement gets involved and pulls them out of the situation. And 99% of the time, they will go back to their trafficker. I've only heard of one case where a child victim of trafficking did not return to her trafficker within 48 hours of escaping her situation. Victims are unaware that what's being done to them is a crime. They either say, well, this is just part of the process. If they're immigrant victims, I brought this upon myself, I'll just manage. Or if they're U.S. citizens, they say, no, I'm fine. I like doing this. I'm making good money. My pimp takes good care of me, or they say my boyfriend takes good care of me. And they'll defend that person. Again, part of that is the trauma bonding. And it's only after advocates kind of work with them for a while that the advocate will say, well, yeah, okay, so you're making good money. Good for you. How much of that money you get to keep? Well, not a bit. Maybe $5. Okay, how's that working out for you? Not so well. The advocates who work with the sexually abused youth in particular are really good at kind of meeting them where they're at, understanding where they are, and then building a relationship off of that where that child will eventually start to provide information to them that might be useful, not only in serving the child, but hopefully eventually in locking up the trafficker. Within our program with the immigrant population, our guys pretty much want to tell us everything. Once they escape the situation, they want to tell us everything that happened. Not really sure why there's that division, but it's very, very common. So due to frequent moves by the trafficker, victims might have no idea where they are. I've literally worked with Mexican victims from Oaxaca, which is down in southern Mexico, pointed to Oaxaca on a map, pointed to Oregon on a map, and they are just stunned and shocked. They really have no physical idea where they are, how much distance they travel. They'll just say, well, first I was on a train, and then I was on a bus, and then I was on in a van, and eventually I was here. And overall, victims aren't seeking help because of distrust, because of fear. It's just very, very hard for victims to actually admit what happened to